start the recording. So once again, it's chapter 3 of the Buried in Treasure handbook, and that's title of the book really associated with helping folks that have hoarding and cluttering challenges, really supporting and guiding people through the path of really identifying the nature of the challenge, and then looking at recommended and research approaches and techniques and strategies for addressing hoarding behaviors. So for those who attended the first week, we really took a conscientious look at what hoarding behavior is like, what's the elements that meet the criteria for hoarding, and really looking at some nuanced perspectives, behaviors, and insight as to the nature of the hoarding problem. So today we're going to take a look at really defining and assessing whether or not the nature of the behavior constitutes a significant problem that really creates a major challenge in that person's life. I want to welcome you to today's meeting, and this meeting, it's important to note that it's ordered by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive meeting. The expectation is that we'll be sharing obviously our observations, sharing our particular experience in the field and how it relates to providing services for people who are either currently dealing with a hoarding problem or are searching for solutions to really address concerns that may amount to a significant challenge in their life. So we encourage you to certainly ask questions and engage as best as you can throughout the session. Please note that the slide and recording will be sent to you via email after the presentation. Can anyone give me an indication as to whether or not they've received, if you've attended part 1, chapter 1, the first session, if you've received that information in terms of the presentation slides and recording? That would be helpful for us to know whether that is occurring timely. Fantastic. So you have received it. Glad to hear that. Thank you so much, Pam, for sharing that information. So that's the expectation, so that you can certainly keep up with each session and get a sense as to what may have been addressed and what's the next step. So that's important for us to kind of keep that on track. So the learning community sessions are a series of sessions over the next 10 months that really addresses each chapter and each subject matter related to the Buried in Treasure handbook. And as you'll see, it really takes you through the process of, first of all, looking at the definition and the distinction of hoarding or cluttering issues, and then really taking you through that process of really helping that person gain some insight, looking at the impact of the particular behavior, and then looking at some assessment tools and some strategies and skills and resources, that can be developed to help that person address the concerns to the point where they can feel that they have some level of control over their environment and the particular challenge related to hoarding behaviors. So the hope is we'll take you through the paces from really identifying what is hoarding to establishing or determining how challenging an issue is it in your life, and really going through that process to really helping that person, or helping you serve the person experiencing hoarding, to maintain a level of success after they've gained some level of control over the particular challenge. So Hannah indicates, I received the slides recording, but I had a hard time accessing today's session. I could not find a registration link and had to email someone. Certainly, sorry to hear that, Hannah, but what is important to note is that the link that you're using for today is the same link you're going to use for every session. So you don't have to change the link. Once you have the link for today, I advise that you put it into your calendar, store it so you can consistently maintain that. Okay, Kimberly, go right ahead.
Actually, Earl, they've been sending a new link out for each session. So I think that's the problem, is that we thought it was going to be the same length, but this last link was not the same one. So some people thought it would be the same, and it's not. I'm getting a new link each session.
All right, I will have to address that at this end because it should be a consistent link.
Yeah, it was last year, but this year I'm getting a new link each time. So I think the folks that are having a hard time accessing, we're trying to use the old link. Fair
enough. So we hope that after this session, hopefully we can have a resolution to that. We'll send a single link. So our apologies for that. We'll try to get that resolved. But thank you for clearing it up, Kimberly. Very good. So this is our guideline for the upcoming sessions and the subject matter. The expectation is certainly that if you are able to acquire the text that we're using, it's the Buried in Treasure, Help for Compulsive Acquiring, Saving, and Hoarding. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Crystal, to put the link to that particular text so you can potentially acquire that if that's helpful. Because the text that we're using is really a great instructional guide to help support someone dealing with hoarding challenges. So the hope is that you'll use that text to guide you, and it's the text that we'll be using. So we're really aligning most of our presentation, our meeting, with that specific book, chapter by chapter. So it's a point of reference that you can continuously use without a need to really pull from other sources. Any questions there? Any questions as to how this learning communities is going to be operationalized, and what's the specifics as it relates to the text we're using and the manner in which we're addressing the concerns? Is that clear to everyone, how the particular learning community operates? You want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Fantastic. So let's keep moseying along. So our general housekeeping, you have the chat option that you can use, and you certainly have the opportunity to raise your hand in the Zoom bar and unmute to engage. We ask that you certainly engage as best as possible. You have the option at the end of the presentation, at the end of the meeting, to download all the chat, the entire thread of chat. You can actually go to your Zoom bar, look for more, press on the 3 dots. It will then give you the option as you go down to look for save the chat, and you'll have the opportunity to save the entire chat. What it will do is send the entire chat to your email that you register for this this session on. So that will be the manner in which you can do that. You have the option as well as to use the call-in option if you are having the video option. You have the option of using the call-in information, and it's available to you. You have the meeting ID and the password that will guide you in terms of getting onto the meeting via the audio option alone. And your video has the option of being on or off. We understand people work in environments where they may not be able to utilize the video option. So that's our housekeeping, to give you a sense as to how we kind of operate. Today, we want to review the significant elements from the first session, which was done in February. And we also want to take a look at insights and coping and challenges to address hoarding behaviors. We want to really take a look at what's the challenge with gaining insight and acquiring coping skills and mechanisms to help people address or manage or take control of hoarding challenges. We want to certainly look at tools to assess problems related to hoarding and cluttering. And those tools are inherent in the book. They're written in the particular guide, so they're tools that you can use in your practice, in your service provision each day. You can take that material from this session into the field so that you can make it part of your toolkit. They are a great deal of assessment tools and approaches that will really help you gain some level of insight into the person's readiness for change, the person's perception of their concerns, and what kind of problem really exists and how to address those problems. Some of the recommended approaches to addressing those specific problems related to hoarding, and some harm reduction principles and tools that will help individuals you serve who are still in the state of pre-contemplation, not certain whether or not hoarding is a problem, and really helping them gain some insight into the challenge and how they may be able to address those challenges. So that's our objectives for today, really get some insight. So we want to first of all take a review for our first session. We want to reiterate that this is a self-help guide. So most of the information really can be used both to support someone in your role as a staff, as a provider, as well as this particular, the tools and the mechanisms we're discussing here can actually be offered to a consumer who is in that state of readiness to actually take on a lot of this on their own. So this can be used as a self-help guide as well. And it could certainly be used for providers to support people who are also dealing with hoarding behaviors. We want to explore, we've looked at exploring the person's relationship to stuff, their collection, their belongings, the things that they hoard. What's their relationship that have them attached to those things in a manner in which has become so distressing or problematic that they can't live their lives in a way that is intended and is meaningful to them. And as part of that particular review, I want to ask if you can take a few moments to complete a poll that really gives us some review of the first session. So even if you haven't attended the first session, take a few moments quickly and provide some response to these questions in the poll, and it will give us a sense as to where you are and what kind of supports we need to provide in today's session. So if you can quickly take a few moments and respond to the poll, it will be helpful. And I hope that everyone is seeing the poll. If you're not, please let me know.
Good.
So I'm going to give everyone another minute to kind of provide some feedback on the poll, and then we'll take a look at the responses. Okay, so let's take a look at feedback, particularly to this poll. So as I indicated, this is a review of session 1. We really went over the basic elements of the diagnostic criteria for hoarding. What are some of the elements of hoarding disorder, and a sense of how providers and people receiving service interact around the subject of hoarding. So the first question of what are the elements of hoarding disorder? And it's important, and I spot on the answer. Most folks really indicated all of the above, which includes difficulty discarding possession, saving items to avoid distress, so really collecting items to stave off distress, clutter spaces that hinder use and design, so really the possession becoming so overwhelming that it's hindrance to the using your home in the way that you would prefer to use it, or it's designed to be used. For example, having so much stuff in your kitchen or living room that you can't occupy it in the way you desire. And ultimately, those behaviors leading to distress and impairment. So those are the hallmark of a hoarding disorder by the diagnostic criteria. So yes, the answer is all of the above. Hoarding can cause problems and not meet clinical diagnostic criteria. Just about 3/4 of you said that's true. And a number of folks said they were unsure, and some folks indicated it was false. The best answer there is yes, hoarding can cause problems and not meet clinical diagnostic criteria. So there's a number of folks that have may have hoarding challenges or challenges with clutter, but it's subclinical. It doesn't meet the full diagnostic criteria for hoarding disorder. So that's the distinction. Thirdly, which of the following statements best reflects reason why people hoard items? And once again, you're spot on. It's all the above. It's really about people having this perception that the stuff they have is beautiful, it's unique in that sense. They could never find another one. Or there's an element that, you know, the utility of that stuff is a primary reason people hold on to it. I might need it later and I can't afford it. Or a sentimental attachment to that item, which is if I give this away, I may lose a memory or part of me. So it becomes so much a definition of who that person is. That is the manner in which people often hoard. So those 3 elements are actually definitions or distinctions of the reason primarily why people hoard items and lose control of their sense of the grandeur of their possessions or the nature of the possessions. Lastly, service providers who work with individuals that are experiencing hoarding behaviors report challenges with assessing the individual's insight into the problem and their readiness to change. And the answer there is true. Oftentimes, the biggest challenge is really helping that person discern or come to grips with a good insight into the nature of the problem and having a sense as to how ready they are or confident they are to make that change, to regain control. And Dia says, looking for resources in Islands, Skagit, and Snohomish. Okay. And we hope here within this particular learning community that people from different regions of the Washington state can actually share resources. And we certainly are committed to also providing as much resources as we can that may spread across the region or maybe located in specific elements of the region. So what I would advise is if you have particular questions about resources, make sure that you are indicating that to everyone. And if you have specific resources, you can share amidst the group here. So I'm hoping that someone may be able to provide some information to Daia. So thank you for that request. So great. I think people generally have a great sense of the elements, the initial concerns or elements about about hoarding disorder, the diagnostic criteria for hoarding disorder, and the nature of the problem and what are some of the challenges, the main challenges supporting people with hoarding disorder. Insight and readiness can be a significant challenge for supporting people with hoarding disorder. So the learning application, we asked participants from the February's session to really track important things they acquire or discarded for a week. I don't know if anyone, and certainly I'm asking a question, if anyone attended session 1 and wants to share whether they did the learning application, I appreciate it. Did you have an opportunity to track the things you acquire within that week or discarded? And if you tracked it, what was easy, what was difficult? And did you notice anything different about yourself in terms of the way you felt about either acquiring it or discarding it? So if you've had the opportunity to do the learning application from the first session, I would truly appreciate feedback as to how it went. And certainly, if you haven't had the opportunity or you did not attend session 1, great. And Hannah provided some feedback. Hannah says, I did track and it was interesting. I was glad I did it. It made me feel like I needed to discard a few more things. Great observation. Thanks for sharing, Hannah. And that's the idea. The idea is really until we take a conscientious, deliberate look at why and how we acquire things or discard things, is sometimes difficult to get an insight as to what kind of relationship we have with stuff. And an important part of recognizing, where we are in relation to the degree of accumulation of possessions we have is to really take a look at why, how, and when we acquire or discard stuff. So once again, for those who may not have attended session 1 or didn't have the opportunity as yet to complete the learning application, I encourage you to try it out for a week within now and our next session next month. And to, if at all, note your responses, note your feelings so we can share. You can share that at our next session. We have the opportunity to kind of learn in practice. As I mentioned in session 1, I'll reinforce here, a major part of supporting people experiencing hoarding behavior is to be able to empathize with where they are, as well as why they do what they do and what is the rationale behind it. So you have a better sense of really addressing not just the behavior, but really supporting people in their processing of their emotional connections with their particular behavior. So it's really a significant element to have that ability to really connect the thoughts, the feelings, and the behavior. Have that kind of triumvirate in place, because it really helps when you're able to see it from those 3 views. It's a lot easier to then connect with people on a really positive emotional level and be able to gain a more trusting, collaborative perspective, so your work can be a little easier, at least a little more collaborative in that nature. Does that make sense to everyone? If you get that kind of perspective, how it may inform your work with people you serve who may be dealing with hoarding? Does that make sense to have that idea of how they process things, how that person may be processing, what kind of feelings that may bring up, and why that leads to specific behaviors? If you're on par with that, fantastic. Thank you. Yes, indeed, Corey. Empathy is an important part of this particular support and assistance process with folks, because this is a difficult subject matter to even discuss. Much less for someone to actually trust you to help them, or to feel a sense that this is even plausible for them to overcome or to gain control over. So it's important to have that empathetic position, empathetic mindset. So please, if you haven't had the opportunity, take the opportunity to apply the learning application in the future. So we want to take a look first at today at really challenges to addressing hoarding and cluttering. What are some of the major challenges? What context do those challenges fall into? What's important to note is that for folks who are really distressed or impaired by hoarding and cluttering, the researchers demonstrate that there's a high comorbidity with depression and anxiety. So oftentimes there is that correlation, that presence, that element where there is an existence of all these challenges simultaneously that often feed each other or impact each other primarily. So oftentimes when we are really working with someone with a hoarding disorder, we tend to find, whether by inquiry or just by that person sharing, that depression and anxiety typically complements the hoarding challenges, or oftentimes can be a causative element. And there's that constant interaction that you have to be conscientious of as well. Oftentimes, collecting possessions to the extent where it becomes overwhelming, or what we describe as hoarding behaviors that leads to that kind of distress, is often used as a form of coping. So it's oftentimes an avoidant form of coping. People use that to avoid dealing with other things. So that's important to note, that in as much as hoarding it's a challenge in itself, it presents its own impairment and its own distressing element. It's oftentimes used to cope with other distress, other sources of stress. And it's often a way of avoiding addressing those things head on, where hoarding becomes the easier path to doing so. As we mentioned, and I think it was alluded to in session 1, as well as your response in the poll, the connections to items is really rooted in emotional or sentimental value. So it's not simply a matter of people just acquiring things because they can. It's oftentimes connected to some kind of emotional, hook and a sentimental value assigned to those particular items. And oftentimes it becomes so substantial and so impactful in that person's here and now and their every action, it leads to that degree of distress and impairment. So it's important to note it has an underlying emotional and sentimental element that keeps people hooked, keeps people attached to those items, and thus it becomes more and more of a challenge to discard. This is exactly the reason why simply going into someone's home and said, why don't we just get rid of all the stuff and you'll be free of the hoarding problems? In your opinion, in your experience, does that approach work? Absolutely. No, it doesn't work. And even if it appears to work, it's just temporary. Because as we know, and Monica says it correctly, because it's hard for the individual to let go. Because you're asking someone to discard not just their possessions, but to discard vital, critical, valued emotions. And we don't get up in any moment and simply say, oh, I don't need to feel a value or connection to something. That is not easy to do. So if it's anything, any takeaway you can have is to remember that even though it may seem inconsequential and insignificant to you as a viewer of the possessions, for most people who have a significant hoarding problem, every one of those possessions may have a sentimental value or an emotional connection that is assigned to it. And that makes it very difficult to simply get up one day and just say, I can get rid of it and not have any attachment to it. And Corey says it's like weight loss. You have the dig into the underlying issues that create new habits. Yes, oftentimes it's a lot of those underlying emotions that really drive the behavior or sustain the behavior. So that's an important element as well. And Nettie says this could be traumatic as folks identify possessions as part of who they are. Absolutely. It becomes so inherent, so intrinsic, that it's not easy to simply get rid of that, because it's tantamount to someone asking you to get rid of an index finger, even though you have on most hands 4 others, right? It may seem inconsequential, like, okay, I have 4 other fingers, I can get along. But losing your index finger changes the manner in which your hand operates, the way you see your hand, the way your life operates. Similarly, hoarding behaviors have those same connotations. And as you'll note, I like to give those kind of analogies that kind of stick in your head. So always remember, if you think of telling someone, get rid of something, always remember to look at your hand and says, but I do that with my index finger. If you can keep that in mind, you have a sense of empathy. So as we mentioned earlier as well, insight is low or absent. Oftentimes when someone has a clinically significant cluttering issue or hoarding issue, insight into its problematic nature or its impairment is oftentimes difficult to garner. Hence why observing it from outside and simply projecting that onto that person doesn't help them gain insight. Simply saying, can't you see that you can't walk in this kitchen because you have so much stuff? Why don't you understand it's a problem? As much as that's logical, it really doesn't work, because that person's level of insight is not that simplistic. It's not that clear and definitive person. You have to really dig a little deeper. And we're going to talk about some assessment strategies that really help you dig deeper and help that person gain some insight. So these are some of the challenges that really present when we're even considering approaching someone with a hoarding challenge, as to what we need to, some hurdles we need to overcome and some hurdles we need to be aware of. So these are some of the major challenges that make it such a challenging and difficult problem to overcome and to gain control over. So that's important to note. So what is important to do is to really gain a sense of the insight that is related to this. What's the trajectory of the level of insight with someone who really has a significant, clinically significant hoarding problem? There is an insight continuum that we often use to really gain that sense. And what you should know is that insight is really a person's capacity to understand the nature and the significance of and the severity of his or her own illness or problems. So it's really that person's capacity to look inwards, and not just look inwards, but to look inwards in a really targeted and specific way to gain that level of awareness. So it's what's inside that feeling element really being projected outwards into a gauge or a measuring stick to have an understanding as to how it may be impacting folks. So insight is not simply, a simple target, a single element. There are grades of insight, and it ranges from denial to a true emotional insight. So it really is on a continuum. So when we look at the continuum, really people can be in total denial. Like, I don't have a problem, what you're saying to me is just your perspective, is subjective, who says I can't live in my house? I'm able to, jump over 15 boxes and get to the bathroom, so that's not a problem, even though that may not be the normal way the house be operating. So you can go from total denial, where the person is totally ignoring the elements. Anything is a nothing. We say everything is nothing and anything is a nothing. So when you have that element, that's a totally different state. Or people can be in a state where there's a slight awareness with denial. Like, yeah, I know I've got too much stuff, but I don't think it's a problem. You know, there's some pre-contemplation, there's some contemplation there. I see it, but I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem as you describe it. Oftentimes, that's what you get when you're working with someone. I know that I probably have too much possessions, but I don't agree that I have a problem like you're describing it. So oftentimes, that's where it gets projected onto you, where the person says, oh, it's not my issue, it's your issue. And then there's the degree of insight that lends itself to awareness with external blame and explanation, right? The sense that the person then looks at it like, yes, I may have a lot of stuff that is really causing some problems in me getting around in my house, but you can't blame me. I don't have a storage unit to put all my valued stuff. Or if they would just give me a subsidy to get a 5-bedroom apartment, right? I wouldn't have this problem, because then I can store all my belongings in the other 4 bedrooms that I'm not using. So there's a rationalization and an excuse, even though there's an awareness that it's a problem. Or the next level of insight is intellectual insight without change, which is I recognize I have a major problem with collecting too much stuff. It's affecting my ability to get around my house. As a matter of fact, I may have rodents or some other stuff impacting my house. This may not be safe for me to get out in case of a fire. As a matter of fact, I may be at risk of, failing an inspection and losing my housing. But I don't know that I'm ready to do anything about it because this is overwhelming. How do you expect me to get rid of all this stuff that I've collected in 20 years? You expect me to do that between now and June when I have that inspection? That's unrealistic. So that's the intellectual insight without change. And then there's the emotional insight with change, which is, as we talked about earlier, the person recognizes this overwhelming collection of stuff that I don't know necessarily that I've used effectively really impacts my sense of safety in my home and my self-wellness in my home. And I want to change this. I want to be able to sit in my living room and use it. I want to have guests. I want to cook without worrying about the fire. And I'm trying to figure out how best to go about making that happen. Can you help me? So that's where we want to get to. But it's a continuum. And what's like any other continuum in this element, people can vacillate. People can be, in a level of insight here one day and go forward and then, kind of go back. So as much as these arrows should be going, both ways, they tend to go back and forth in that sense. People can be in a different level of insight based on where they are in that moment or related to specific items. Because people may have great insight into one element, like, okay, all my paper stuff I know I need to get rid of, but no, don't touch my shoes and clothes and tools, right? No, the insight for tools and clothing may be denial, whereas there may be an intellectual insight without change or with change for paper items. So there's that nuance that you may have to actually help that person negotiate. So that's the insight continuum. And what's important to note is that behavior reinforcement loops. So it's how do we reinforce those behaviors that really help that person avoid a level of avoidance. So it's important for us to get a sense as to how things occur and the emotional connection that drives certain behaviors. So oftentimes there's a triggering or a stressor, and that leads to a negative emotion. A classic example is someone was living with a partner, lost their life partner, or lost their, job, or lost whatever significant traumatic triggering stressor occur. And then the person feels sad, feels, without value, may feel depressed. They may have all of those emotional elements there. And that negative emotion, that sense of not feeling well within themselves, can also lead to avoid discarding. So the stressor may not really help that person kind of make some tangible elements towards moving. So the person may actually use that stress. So I feel depressed. What makes me feel better when I'm depressed? I go to the mall and I purchase some things. Makes me feel better for a moment. So the person moved from losing their loved ones to feeling that negative emotion and loss and grief. And the way they try to address that is really using that kind of avoidant coping mechanism, and they start acquiring stuff. Every time I buy an item, I buy a new bag, a new shoes, I feel great in that moment. I don't feel as distressed as I was feeling, and therefore I keep doing that with the hope that it's going to sustain for a bit. And then typically once they do that, it may impact another wellness dimension. You keep shopping at the mall, what happens eventually? You start recognizing that you may be using money for other needs, and that then leads to financial stress. So here comes another stressor in an attempt to address a stressor. And more of that stress leads to that negative emotion. Now, what kind of person I am? I'm already dealing with grief and loss. Now I'm spending all my money. I can't pay my rent, and I can't manage to keep my budget in order. Now I feel like crap. And when I feel like crap, I figure out what helps me feel better when I feel like crap. Okay. I'm able to get something, some quality stuff, some antique. So now you don't go to the mall. What that person then does is go to the yard sale, right? And buy some antiques that remind them of the person that they lost, right? That husband or that partner may have liked, particular items. And then the person then purchases that particular item in a yard sale. Oh, I got it cheap, so it doesn't impact my budget as much. But then it reminds me of how much I love John that I lost. And then you go through that reinforcement loop all the time. And people can be on that wheel for infinitum. So does that make sense in terms of how someone can get on that loop? It's almost like the hamster wheel of triggers, stressors, avoidant, coping, triggers, stressors, avoidant, coping, and keep on that loop. Does that make sense? Does that help you kind of understand the loop that person can be on, that can be reinforcing those negative coping mechanisms? Absolutely, Christine. I know for a lot of us, we may be able to relate. Sometimes it's unconscious, but some of us, we know, hey, I tend to do that sometimes, or I see my consumers do that, or I see my loved ones do that, and I wish I could put it into words to help it make sense. This is a great way of doing so. So this is certainly a tool that you can present to that person and say, take a look at this. Do you see this happening in your life? Do you see you kind of responding in this way? It often can be very helpful in that regard to really gain at least some sense of insight. May not have a sense as to how to address it, but the person can see how they can keep themselves in a state of dysfunction by simply going through this reinforcement loop and avoidance all the time. And this is a major mechanism of hoarding behavior. This reinforces an avoidance loop. So what is important to note is that hoarding behaviors are the causes of stress and the comfort from stress. So it can have that duality, because it's important to note people don't simply hoard because it, immediately alleviates some feeling of distress. It can be kind of that loop. it can cause it and then comfort it. So people can use hoarding both to address triggers and also to seek comfort from the resulting emotional dismay or poor feelings. And I know a lot of you have said you've witnessed this loop and reinforcement. Have most of you seen this occur with people you serve or people you loved ones, or for those who are here for their own ways of looking at their behavior? Do you see that within yourself and see it in your behavior? Is this common? Is this familiar? Indeed. And Nettie says, I have a large food bowl which belonged to my parents who both passed in the last 10 years. I have no practical use for it. It reminds me of my parents, so I'm still holding on to it, but I don't use it. I know. And that's, thank you for sharing. That's very common. And, unconsciously we can be, like we said, maintaining a sentimental connection with that stuff. And it can become problematic in that sense. Absolutely. And Corey says, yes, it's a common cycle I've seen. So this is where what we're trying to do to really get people, both who are providing supports and both who are in the throes right now of addressing their own hoarding concern, to really take a look at it from that emotional connection standpoint, and not just as a behavioral stuff in terms of, okay, you've got too much stuff, you need to do something about it. Really understand what's all the things behind that behavior. And it's not really looking for causation, but it's looking for connections, those emotional connections that impact the behavior. And Katerina says, yes, we see some who start to weed out things, but end up buying more to replace it. And we'll talk a lot about, there's some specific strategies for helping people who do that. And some of it is already known. There's a concept of if you buy one, you have to get rid of two. There's some elements to that. But yes, oftentimes there is that reinforcing element of, oh, I feel great getting rid of two, but then I feel sad that I lost some of the things that I value. And then maybe if I go buy a new one, you can't say something I'm holding on from old, but it's still a possession. And Hannah says it's not problematic to have a few sentimental belongings that you don't use though, right? Just if everything starts to become sentimental, or if it starts causing you distress or prohibiting use of rooms as designed. Hannah, you answer that question yourself. Yes, we all have things that we have sentimental connection to. The big element is, are we collecting it in such numbers that it becomes a source of distress or limits or prohibits us from utilizing our space? Or we spend so much time ruminating about holding on to it that we are not able to function in the manner in which we desire. So yes, spot on. So we want to look at when someone is actually ready to discuss this, or if they're not ready. Where is that person in terms of their level of insight? So if the person is open to discussing hoarding behaviors as a problem, we want to try to assess the problem. Because as Hannah stated very clearly, it's not simply having a connection with something sentimental or an intrinsic value. It's the nature of the relationship and how much it's maybe impacting or causing distress or impairment in our functioning. So we want to assess whether it's merely a problem or it's such a significant impairment in our lives. Assessment can build insight to change behavior. So we start first. Remember, we don't start by actually telling someone, if you get rid of stuff, your life will be better. We want to get to the underlying connection that person have with the stuff, and then help them build insight, gain insight into why they do what they do. Why is it connected to these specific distressing behaviors or concerns, so that when we're addressing the efforts to manage it, the person is both looking at the behavior and the emotional significance of why they're behaving in that way. So it's important that when that person is open to discussion, we try as best as we can to get assessing the problem as quickly as we can, and then helping that person build insight to change the behavior. Because behavioral change can only come when that person buy in after they've gained insight and see themselves as needing to change because it's going to benefit them, not necessarily someone on the outside. If resistant to discussing hoarding problems as a problem, we need to look at engaging in harm reduction. If that person is living particularly in an environment that is leased or otherwise, and there's rules to follow, and their hoarding behaviors impacting their safety or their ability to sustain their housing, then we need to look at simple approaches that may reduce the extent of the harm. So even if somebody's not ready or willing to address the whole element of their hoarding behavior, we may want to look at harm reduction approaches that help them maintain those critical elements of their lives, right? Housing, food, clothing, those Maslow's basic needs. We want to make sure that they are at least able to address that with an understanding that maybe then that can spur or promote addressing the underlying hoarding behavior that is causing these risk concerns. We want to help that person minimize risk. So promote having a safer home or reducing other harms like eviction, financial despair, those elements. So when the person may not be fully ready or don't have the level of insight to engage in change, they don't have that intellectual insight and readiness for change, we want to look at harm reduction and promoting a safer home or reducing other harms that may be impacting the person, other aspect, dimensions of their lives. My question to you is, when you mention hoarding behaviors, are people generally open to discussing more about that? What's your experience been like? Yeah. Unfortunately, most of the times the answer is no, I'm not ready, or there's avoidance, let's get off that subject. Why are you judging my home? How dare you come into my home and tell me what I should have and shouldn't have? You get a lot of that. So it's important to, and most folks will tell you don't take it personally. That's not one of the things I will tell you. I say, just look at it as that person is not in a state of readiness. It's not about you. And it's not an indictment on your skills or your ability to support them. They are not at a place where they're ready to take an action that can help them address that. And that's their right. So you begin to say, well, listen, I'm aware that you don't see this as an issue, but I want to help you maintain your housing because you mentioned your housing is important to you. How can I help you, pass the inspection, the upcoming inspection, or keep your egress and exit safe enough so that you're able to get out here if there's any kind of medical emergency. So you start having those conversations about harm reduction. Now, if you're lucky and someone is ready, chomping at the bit to get started and working on this, we want to take a look at some avenues, some strategies, some approaches to helping that person really gain greater insight into their hoarding concerns. So if individual is open to discussing cluttering head-on, we want to use the buried and treasured tool to assess hoarding behaviors or clutter. So we want to beat the iron while it's hot. When that person is open to it, you have to be ready to really get into the assessment tools. And there's some specific assessment tools to help gain insight. Assessing severity of the problem. How significant is the problem that the person has as it relates to hoarding and clutter? So we use the hoarding rating scale. We want to assess the extent of interference with daily activities, how it may be affecting that person's ability to live in their home and really live their lives fully. We want to look at the extent to that the safety is compromised. What safety concerns relate to their hoarding behavior? And the extent of the problem with sanitation in the home. Are they able to maintain some level of sanitation, safety, and just general health as it relates to sanitation? So those are some of the hoarding assessment tool to help person gain greater insight the minute they indicate, I know I have a problem, I'm not certain how to approach it. This is where you start with the assessment approaches. So they're very specific, those assessment tools, and there's a few examples of them. Certainly we have the hoarding rating scale, and it's important if you have the book to really take a conscientious look at these and become familiar with them. When we talk about the hoarding rating scale, we're really looking at some questions that really help us determine the extent of the issue. So a good example would be, because of clutter or a number of possessions, how difficult it is for you to use the room in your home. So we're really assessing the utility of the person's space. To what extent do you have difficulty discarding or recycling or selling or giving away ordinary things that other people would get rid of? You know, the big amount of plastic bags that have no use, but the person's holding on to it because, you know, A&S or whatever stores they use for is no longer in existence, but these bags have a sentimental connection. When I was a kid, my mom took me, that was the first store I shopped. All those sentimental connections to it that they're holding on to 50 bags from A&S that they don't rarely use on a regular basis. So these are this is the most simple, straightforward, basic, preliminary assessment that you can do, a hoarding rating scale. And what's important to note is that each question has a numerical value to it. And generally speaking, we consider an issue to be significant when the person's response is a 4 or moderate or greater. So if the person have a score of 4 or greater, there is a significant problem. If there's a score on items of 1 or 2, 2 may have a difficulty with discarding, 3 may be challenges with acquiring. So there's a way of rating that scale, and you can actually use this with the person or ask the person to use it themselves and give you some feedback. So that's an important, simple, basic one that kind of gets the ball rolling. Secondly, we look at is my home safe? So we're talking about safety in terms of what are the risk oriented with that person's current collection or clutter. Is there any structural damages to the floor, walls, roof, or other parts of your home? Would medical emergency personnel have difficulty moving equipment through your home? So egress and the space to be able to do that. So these are some of the preliminary and basic assessment tools that you can use to gain some initial insight into that person's safety, as well as the degree of the hoarding and collection issues. Are you familiar with this? Has anyone seen these assessments before? Is this something you've come across? Do you see this being useful in your support with people with hoarding? Okay, great. People have seen it before. We would love to have a copy. We will certainly provide that to you. And I'm glad that you see it as being able to be useful. Yes. Fantastic. We found this to be the most impactful because they're simple, they're early in the stage working with people, and people can always come back to it to gauge their progress. You know, I started out this process, here's where I was, now here is where I am. So great, we're lucky if the person is ready and we're able to use those initial assessment to gain some insight and to help them see where the significant problem lies. And then we want to look now at what if the person is not ready? You know, there's significant denial. the person doesn't want to address hoarding or clutter or focus on even reducing harm. They're like, not a problem. It's not my problem. It's yours. Get out of my house. How dare you come in here with your judgments and your, bougie eyes looking at my home. You can hear all kinds of rationalizations, right? Or avoidance. So once again, we look at some assessment tools or approaches to doing that. We check someone's apartment for health and hygiene. And there's an actual assessment tool for that. It's the home and personal hygiene scale. You can check the apartment against health and safety benchmarks. So there's a healthy and safe home initial benchmark assessment. There's also to help prepare for an inspection. So there's a uniform inspection checklist that can be used. So when someone is not ready and don't want to discuss it, these are some of the things that you can actually use to help that person really begin to take a look at, hey, there's an inspection coming up. Take a look at this and let me know if you think you're ready to do that. If you're ready to pass that inspection, is your home safe? So these are some of the assessment tools that we can certainly use as well to help people if they're not necessarily have the degree of insight that would help them get to that place. So there are some suggestions for providing assessments. Even though we have those tools, they're available to us. It's important the manner in which you address them takes precedence. Manner in which you use those tools. Some of the things that you need to lay the foundation for is going to be critical and important to gaining success with utilizing those assessment tools. Use respectful verbal and nonverbal language. What is important is people don't respond well to negative comments about their homes. You go in and you say like, oh my goodness, what a mess. I can't believe I haven't seen you in 2 weeks and it's looked like you have collected more garbage than the local landfill. That is not a way to approach it. Even though you may be feeling that inside, that's not the way to approach it. You certainly want to be respectful, both in your verbal and nonverbal, which means if you are put off, if you turn up your nose or you're stepping back so far, it's obvious that you don't feel comfortable with that person's state of affairs. That sends the same message as if you said it was a mess. So that's important to note. And I want to pause for a quick moment here. I want you to just take that in, and we'll get back to you. We'll get back to it in a moment. Just wanted to kind of keep that in mind for a moment. It's very good. So it's important. This is one of those things where you oftentimes have one opportunity to set a good first impression. And that should really start with that initial relationship building, that engagement tool, really demonstrating respect. How do you give me a phrase that you use or a particular superlative that you use to really set the tone of respect when you're engaging with someone who has a hoarding disorder? What are some of your catchphrases that you use that kind of work towards really demonstrating respect? What works for you? I know for me, I state the obvious, which is oftentimes I started by saying, let's think of it. Deborah, I really appreciate you inviting me into your home and allowing me to be able to engage with you here. I know from your own feedback, this is not often the easiest thing for you to do, but I really appreciate you honoring me with that opportunity. And Melissa, yes, maybe another step, but that's a great place to start. Asking clients' preference of what they would like to focus on. And oftentimes, that's going to be consistent throughout your engagement with them. But in the early phases, it's really about respecting that person and letting them know that it's important for them to know that you do respect them and your words and your actions. And Dana says, thank you for inviting me to your home. I'd like to get to know you and learn more about what your belongings mean to you. Oh, Dana, I'm going to ask to steal that one. That is spot on. That is perfect. I can put that up on a placard and make that a template. That's fantastic. Great job. So we all are going to steal Dana's, and she's going to permit us to do so. Asking what they may need. Yes. Because if you remove the discomfort, the things that is making everyone uncomfortable, you opening the door. Make it a known that it's a challenge for the person to have you in their home, because even if they don't have insight as at the degree of insight, there's some sense that there is a little discomfort with having you in their home because they know things may not look the way it should. Validation, says Nettie. This is hard to do, having this discussion. On your collections, things which are so important to you. So thank you so much for being willing to meet me to discuss. Absolutely. You guys are great at validation and really getting that initial trusting relationship going. Fantastic. So match the person's language. Use the language they use to describe their possessions, my things, my possessions. Whatever name they use, if you match that, it's important. Now, matching is different than just mimicking. It may seem like one and the same, but it's a little different. Matching means you are actually saying what you're saying in the way you would, but you use that terminology. But mimicking means that when the person says it, you automatically repeat it. That's not what you want. You want it to be natural. Absolutely, Christy. Joining to develop rapport. It's important and critical. Avoid touching objects in the home. People often have strong attachments to their possession. A general order of business, even outside of issue around hoarding, you should not be touching people's stuff without their permission. It's just not a good thing to do when you're in people's home. And I know working in the community in people's home is a challenge, but hands to yourself, we say. Best way to go. Limits a lot of issues, but with hoarding, even more particular. Avoid making suggestions about the person's belongings. An example, there are 3 extra copies of things you're unlikely to use. That's not your place. You're not ready for that yet. That person has to invite you into that place. If they're saying, oh, I've got 20 magazines that, I don't really need, you can simply respond by saying, well, that's a significant observation. Tell me more about that. What does that mean to you? Why is that important to share that with me? So you're beginning to start already cueing into those change thoughts. So that's important. Start by certainly, acknowledging that person's willingness to share that with you. Avoid focusing early on removal. Do not go in there and start talking about, oh, you can move this and move that, and your living room will be clear. Not a good place to start. Focus on safety initially and put yourself in their shoes. If all these things are important to me, why would you tell me to move? That's not a good place to start. If it's a safety concern, then you simply talk about, the importance of having the opportunity to get in and out of your house safely. If there's a medical emergency, how does EMS get in? Questions, not suggestions first. Questions that inspire that person to find the answer for themselves. We want to lead that person to the answer, not give them the answer. I'm hoping that that helps in terms of some of the guidance in terms of even approaching the assessment process with that person. And I think you mentioned how, these it's obviously helpful, but this is important to keep. If there's this thing you can take away, have this guidance with you to help you really stay in the mode of the person, thoughtful, empathetic, and supportive of that engagement with that person. So normally we'll take a break, but I kind of made the break quite early, so we'll just kind of mosey along if you don't mind, so we can respect your time and get the most out of it. Is everyone okay with us moving ahead? Bravo. Want to keep the rhythm going, right? Same as though we're working with someone with hoarding. We get into that rhythm, we have to keep it going. So assessment of impairment. Are your daily activities impaired by hoarding? Because ultimately, the critical element of the hoarding disorder, the state where it's that impairing, is to really look at the impairment it has. Because if people are collecting a lot of stuff, but it's not impairing their function and it's not distressing them, then there isn't a problem. So it's important to really gauge the level of impairment. And we do that by really looking at those daily activities. Are those daily activities negatively impacted by the degree of stuff that you've collected? And that's an important place to start. Think of what would be a question you would ask someone to gauge their impairment in daily activities. What would be a question you'd ask to kind of get a sense as to whether or not the person's hoarding behaviors are impacting their daily lives? I'm glad that the tools are great. Yes. A classic example would be, based on the stuff that I see you have collected here and have so much value attached to these items, how would you describe to me your ability to utilize your kitchen in the way you intended? And Corey says often people are sleeping on the sofa and they don't want to get back in their bedroom, so sometimes that can be a starting point. Yes, a great starting point. I noticed that you seem to be occupying using your sofa for your sleeping purposes. Is there a particular reason for that? Because you want to be very careful. You want to be like, why are you not using your bedroom for sleeping? That's kind of a pointed, judgmental, even if you don't mean to be judgmental. You may want to start with, hey, I noticed that you're sleeping on the couch. Is there a particular reason for that? Or I noticed you're sleeping on your couch. We've been talking about this for a number of weeks now. Does it have any relation to your the state of your bedroom? Can you help me understand what that is? There a connection there? So it's a great place to kind of begin to touch bases with. But this particular assessment tool, the daily activities impairment of hoarding, it's a great one to really help someone see how they may be limiting their normal or general use of their living space. This assessment tool can speak to more than you can ever say in an hour of discourse, because it's very pointed and it helps that person gauge it. So that's one of the tools you should really take a good look at. Assessment of home and safety, we've talked about that in terms of the home environment index. This is a very specific one to significant areas of safety. Fire hazard, state of the particular living structure and the state of your food. Is there any structural damage? Are parts of your home unsanitary? Really pointed questions that are specific, does not come from you, does not sound that you're making a judgment, really opens that person to taking a good look at some specific areas. So there's lots of questions there that can really be helpful. And you need to think of those questions. If you have a good understanding of these assessments, it really lends itself to you having more of a repertoire of questions that really can start a conversation and really help that person to gain some insight. So the home environment index is a great one to really help you get a sense of the safety of the home, so that you don't have to go in there saying, oh, John, I noticed that you can't get out of your house, you know, or the windows are blocked. You don't want to get into that, because that becomes about you pointing out things that are judgmental. This particular assessment really helps you help that person assess their own view of safety, sanitary conditions, and so forth. Now, what we know is that the best assessment, unless there's some buy-in, it doesn't really help if the person is rejecting the assessment, right? Ignoring or refusing services because the person is not ready. Remember that it's important to note that services are optional, and they're you know, and there may be potential harm. It's important to recognize that. We then utilize the harm reduction principles. We talk about maintaining your home according to your lease standards, general safety concerns, egress and exit, you know, getting in and out of your home. Are those impaired? Is your safety concerns in place? Is your home livable? Is your actions and behaviors with regards to acquiring stuff negatively impacting your financial status? Your ability to pay rent, your ability to buy food, your ability to maintain other utilities, pay other utilities. Remember, as much as we may not all well, I'm not going to assume anything, you may not be physicians, but do not harm or don't force changes. That's not the place you want to start. And KC says, when someone is facing eviction due to hoarding, but do not seem to be able to make progress, is very difficult. Absolutely. Sometimes it can be so frustrating, right? You feel like, what do I need to do to break through for this person? I'll tell you the answer. There's not much you can do to help that person break through. You have to actually help that person gain some insight, as we talked about earlier. So in this instance, when it comes to eviction concerns, harm reduction is probably the best approach, but it's not a fail-safe. You know, it's not the panacea. It's not going to work for everybody. Some people literally have to be evicted and be homeless before they even consider hoarding as a problem, unfortunately. And I'm just being as realistic as I can. But the more insight they gain, maybe the second round can improve. When they get that next apartment, there's a better sense of some of the preventative measures that can be taken in place. And no two situations are identical. You can have identical twins, and we've had research that shows that have hoarding, similar personalities, similar attachments, and yet their particular way of viewing their possessions and responding to interventions may be different. Family members who live in the same home may have a different view. So it's never identical in that sense. Change is slow, but it can be progressive. Remember, failures to change are not harm reduction failures. So even if the person is not able to remove all the items and become a perfect, create a perfect environment, it does not necessarily, you know, demonstrate a failure to reduce harm. there may be a point where you start with a hope that things can progress in that sense. And remember, even though you may see hoarding as the priority problem that person may be facing, that person may have other priorities. We've seen instances where people have a major hoarding problem, but their major priority at that point may be about getting financially stable or maintaining some financial stability. And the person may be like, I don't want to talk to you about my thing. I want you to talk about my budget. And don't ask me how much I'm spending at the mall. I want you to look at my specific disability payment as to how to pay my rent. You know, I have my mall money that I'm not going to talk to you about. So there's priorities in terms of what challenges that person wants to address. So it's important to look at the harm reduction principles. It's a great guide as to how do you really begin to help that person, particular person who is not ready to make changes, but how can you assist that person in reducing harm? You start by really having a commitment to not doing harm, but helping that person really look at it from their perspective. So there's a number of inspection tools that we've talked about. There's the uniform inspection checklist that you can actually use with that person. There's a homes and safe home initial benchmark. So these are some tools you can use. This one is became very popular and prominent through the Philadelphia Hoarding Consortium. And the home and safety home initial benchmarks, it was really helpful in helping people, particularly who just acquired a first apartment or had a history of homelessness, to really begin to gauge the benchmarks for those initial safe home elements. So keep all doors clear of belongings so that they can be open freely, reduce all piles near the windows. So these are almost some great support tools and support advice you can give people who may have a hoarding problem, is not ready to tackle the whole problem, but want to have some level of reduction in harm. This is a great place to start. So try the health and safety home initial benchmark. Use the benchmark to check health for safety in the immediate environment. So you may want to start with the immediate environment. After checking, you want to consider what needs work, what could you do, and how could you use this with consumers, if so. Do you see this as something that you can use with consumers? How do you see it really positively impacting the initial work with that person? What do you just think of that for a moment? Because there's a lot of assessments I'm throwing at you today, but I want you to see the potential utility of each one and a sense that this is something that you can really add to your toolkit and also share with the person who's dealing with hoarding behaviors for them to use themselves. So a lot of this can be done through self-help. I like that, Christy. Absolutely. It's not judgmental and state helpful ways to stay safe. That's what the focus is. So it's more caring, thoughtful. Absolutely, says Corey. It's absolute. These tools are really, what we want to do is to build a bridge with that person and help that person have some tools that they can use even in your absence to kind of keep things moving along. So tips to help someone prepare: explain the practice, the process, whether you're using the tools. These are some of the things you want to make sure you're doing. Give the person as much control as possible. Ask permission before opening anything. Be descriptive with the inspection issue, right? Describe to that person exactly what the inspection is going to be like, where you're going to go, what you're going to be looking at, and what your responses are going to be. You don't want to be like, well, you failed this inspection. That's not what you're using. Hey, I noticed that there's some things that you can improve on here, or you may want to make some changes to pass your inspection. Meet outside the home to discuss concerns and change. Don't go into it and then start this discussion, because that may turn the person off. You want to give that person as much predictability as they can before you start the process of assessing. Do you use any of these approaches when you're using any assessment with people who are hoarding? Let's think of that for a moment. So we want to move quickly through it. These are some things to bring up. When you bring up the tools, these are some of the things you want to make sure that you're focusing on. These are some of the people that you may want to be involved in that process. Look for upcoming inspections or visit. That's a great place to start. The person feels that, okay, there's a win. They can have an early win, so it can keep the momentum going. And I want to make sure that we have, I know we're running out of time. I want to make sure that we have a moment for you to share your responses, evaluation, if you can take a few moments to kind of provide some feedback. Because what's important is that we want to make sure that this training is responsive to your needs. Want to get a sense as to what we're doing well in terms of how we're presenting this material and guiding this process, and what we can do differently to better support you in your efforts to working with people with hoarding disorder. So once again, I want to thank you for your participation. I certainly want you to share your feedback with us so that we can use those to inform our future meetings. And it's important to note that this is a very challenging endeavor, and any effort to move people in the direction of change is a win. So an important element to take into consideration. But thank you again. I want to make sure that we've addressed our concerns today. We looked at the assessment tools that are useful in terms of getting people to gain insight. We looked at the insight continuum on what it is that people go through in their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how we can get the ball moving as it relates to helping people really take control of their challenges as it relates to hoarding. So the next learning application for next month, I want you to try to or share a tool from them, the assessment tool, particularly the one for preparing for an inspection, and be prepared to discuss it, how it went, what went well, what went challenging, and what was challenging for you. And our next meeting is on Tuesday, April 25th at the same time. And once again, I make that commitment to working with our team here to see if we can develop that one link, that single link, so you can use consistently. So I'll certainly get back to you on that, and I'll pass that through Kimberly. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time and attention, participation in today's webinar. We'd like to remind you that the links and the slides and the recording will be made available to you. Don't forget to check out our Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS and any upcoming training and events. Thank you once again. Have a great rest of the day and a fantastic week. We look forward to seeing you next month for Chapter 4. Thank you very much. And if you have a question, you certainly can pose that question. We'll stay a few minutes to answer those questions.